Okay, this one's really, really used up. So when I use my kneaded eraser, okay, you'll start to see it works exactly like Play-Doh. Stretch it out. There's that sort of hints of darker and lighter grays. That's what you want. You want to kind of sort of mold it enough so you could use that cleaner surface. So right about here, okay? So you can start to remove some of that charcoal off your sheet of paper, okay? I also have my white standard eraser as well. And let me get out some of my charcoal. So I have a whole, again, I'll leave this on campus. So those of you who do need charcoals, you can just come on in and I can give you some. I have my compressed. The compressed is the one that's squared. So keep that in mind. The vine is the soft round. It's very light. It literally feels like there's nothing in your hand. The compressed has more weight, which is really interesting. So there's a really interesting difference between both. Put that on my side of my paper towel. And then I'm gonna take some of my white. Obviously, some of them are dirty. It's okay. I'll show you areas in terms of how to clean it, how to make it much more accessible. I've actually had students make value with just the white, which is really interesting. What you can do is actually compress this down to a powder and use water. And you can use this as a wash. That's a really interesting example. And one of my students did that with her, I think it was the ink wash and the still life, which was really interesting. Okay, so let me get my reference. Bear with me. Oh, my camera is moving, or no. There you go. Just gonna pull my reference. And again, guys, so I do apologize. I don't see or hear anybody. So if you have any questions, just pop your question and just say your name. Say, hey, this is X, Y, and Z speaking. Can you do that again? Or repeat what you just did or said. Just bear with me and get my reference out. So I'm gonna use, which reference is interesting? We'll use this one because I think this is always the more interesting one. I'll do a screen share so you guys can see what I'm seeing. Just bear with me. Okay, where is Zoom? So this is what I'm going to be using for the demo, okay? Any questions about this before I start? Okay. All righty. Put that on my side. I can see everything else. Okay, so how do I start? Ideally, you take your vine, the one that's rounded, the one that has no weight. The vine is very easy to use when you're starting off with a gesture, okay? When you're sort of mapping out where things are in the relationship of each object. What is the biggest? Which one's the widest? How further away that book is in relationship to the jar, to the glass, so on and so forth, right? What I like to do, okay, is really be very loosey-goosey, okay? Not a single idea of detail that I want in my mind at these early stages. And the reason why is because I want to sort of just get my foundation down, okay? So what I like to do is sort of work very loose. And I'm just gradually, very lightly, kind of hovering over my paper, and I'm letting gravity do its job. I'm not pressing any pressure onto my surface, okay? Just take my index and just take it to my tip, okay? You could hold it like this. Again, there's no wrong way to hold it. And I just want to sort of get in the feeling of where things are. Just making abstract marks. Here is sort of a really interesting kind of loose composition. And you'll see what happens once we put things together. Okay, now this looks really strange, right? But what I want you to do is break this in half. and use a small piece as its side. So you're just gonna let it go and hold that on the surface. This will cover more ground on our surface of our paper. And I notice my reference image is sort of wider on my drawing, excuse me, on my photograph than my drawing. So I'm compressing it slightly, or I can just crop my image. So for example, what I mean by this is, just to make sure you guys are aware of what I'm seeing. So this, everybody can see this, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm cropping it to right about here. And let me just do that now. So it's right about there, because my paper is taller than it is wide, okay? So just to let everybody know, let me crop that out and let me go to stop screen share, okay? So then now the sort of center would be that decanter with the M, okay? That logo of the M is right about here. The base of that candle is here. The glass goblet is on the bottom, and that rose quartz rock is right here. I've sort of mapped out where things are. Again, this is sort of one way to do this. It's not the right way, it's not the long way, but this is what I think helps best when starting off the drawing. Now I'm using the side, right, of my vine, still my vine. And I'm going to work with that sort of white planter. And I'm applying a little bit more gravity. And that's the composition of the first object that I'm going to put, okay? Now it's not too much pressure, it's about medium, okay? You don't want to do something much more aggressive like that. It's very, very dark. Let's say if you made a mistake, you could also just use your fingers to massage it away, or take your kneaded eraser and kind of erase as much as you can off. Notice there's a sort of a residue that's left, okay? Those of you who are not interested in having this, remember you could take your white eraser, take as much force as you can and take it off, but then all of it will not come off, which is okay, because some of those imperfections you want. Some of those imperfections will actually see through your layering process, okay? So it's okay to make mistakes, but if you really don't want to do that and be really cautious, this is why working lighter with the vine is a lot easier, because once you erase, it's going to be much more simpler. Say, for example, I made an error on this area. Take your kneaded eraser, all of it is gone. But if I did that with my vine with a harder amount of pressure, it's going to be a lot more difficult to erase. Same thing with the compress. We'll do that a little bit later on, okay? So here is my white planter. I'm just going to color this in. And I'm actually going to massage this. Use my fingers. And this is the part when it gets really dirty. And it's okay. I'm going to let that be for now, because I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to go over with darks and whites, and we'll see how to create that highlight from that natural light that's coming in from the right. Okay. Now I can see right to the right of that is that other smaller candle. Right there. Okay. Now I have that decanter, and it's probably around about here. Okay. But there's also other sides, right? Notice it's foreshortened. One side is facing this way, the other side is facing that way. What I can do is just going to massage it onto my surface, massage my candle. And don't let this confuse you, because this is sort of where things can be experimental. You can make these mistakes early before we get into the quote unquote, the details. You are not focusing on any of the details yet. Here is that muddler, the wooden muddler. Notice it's foreshortened. So the base of that muddler on the bottom, it's kind of closer to us. This is that idea going back to the question, I forgot who asked that question earlier about the camera obscura. I do apologize. Who asked that question?
That was me, Aista.
Aista, okay, thank you for that, Aista. This is a really interesting example of how we can, again, visually look at that actual object in three-dimensional space. What's closest to us is the base. What's further away is receding to that background, obviously it gets cut off by the edge of the tape, which is completely okay, but then I can now put that in there. Okay, and then now on the bottom, what about here is where that rose quartz is. Now the rose quartz rock is very sharp. It's not as soft like these three objects here. What I like to do is kind of make sort of really aggressive lines that kind of create the object, but then also go back and do the same thing with my fingers and kind of massage that in there. Okay, and we haven't even talked about the background yet, which we'll get to in a little bit. Okay, I have my goblet. Now this is where the question always comes up of how do I draw glass, right? In relationship to something that's solid. This is transparent. What's the difference? It's something from opaque to transparency. We'll get into that a little bit later on. Okay, it's my goblet, base of the goblet. Okay, and then the book where it says the beginning of Caravaggio. Oh, there's that book. I was looking for that book. Do I still have that? Hopefully I still have that book. Now the book is much more structural, meaning it's straighter. It's not as organic like the other material. But then there is a really interesting box right on top of that, a sort of decorative box. So I kind of have an idea where things are. But then now I'm also going to take the top here, where the head of the decanter, which is the a stag or a what is it in American? A deer. Excuse me. There's the horns. Okay, that's the head of the stag. I'm going to blend that in there. Okay, but then that eucalyptus, same thing. Now I'm going to be very loose with the eucalyptus because the background, which has the variety of the eucalyptus, is very sort of kind of scattered throughout the background. So I'm going to start from the bottom and just make some vertical lines. Just being mindful of my image. And it's okay if I go over some of my objects. But then I notice right around here in that background of the plaid, there's value. So I'm going to take the base of my vine, just actually make some marks on that shadow. And then same thing here. But then also there's some shadows here. Okay, blend that in. Okay, do the same thing on the other side. Now I notice obviously my vase is white, obviously, but then around it it's really dark. So what I'm going to do is work around that form. This goes back to the earlier question of darkening that background, and I forgot who asked that question. I apologize in advance. Okay, and come around here to do the other side. But then also looking at how the snake plant, notice obviously when once your charcoal becomes really obviously dissolved on the surface, just move on to your next charcoal. So keep that in mind. But I like to be economical and use as much as I can. So I'm going to take the tip and start making some lines for my eucalyptus. Oh, excuse me, for the snake plant. I think it's called snake plant, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think I still have this plant. Just hopefully it's not dead, which I try to keep all my plants alive, but I'm not that good at keeping my plants alive. hopefully I will do better. Here's the base. Here's the base of my base. Excuse me, of the base of the top. Beautiful, like lime green colors there. Okay, that's my snake plant. There you go. Can we see this, guys? Hopefully you guys can see that clearly. Any problems not looking at it clearly? Hopefully.
Yep.
Okay.
It looks clear.
Perfect. Thank you. So then now I'm going to switch to my compressed. This is the one that's square. Okay. You guys can see that. Okay. This is where things can get really tricky. Okay. The reason why I say this is because now if we move to the compressed, it's hard to go back for erasing. Okay. It's extremely dark, which could be a benefit. Okay. But it could also be very, very tricky to use. So I'm just going to break it in half. It's a little bit harder to break. Again, it has a little bit more weight in the vine. And now you will start to see a difference between if I add a shadow, we'll add a shadow here in relationship to what we made here. I'm going to blend some of this area in a little bit. Now I'm literally modeling the form of that vase. Okay. I'm going to use the side of my compressed. I know it's hard to see with my hands being dirty. I apologize. Use my other hand. Okay. Use the side. Okay. On the surface. Now it looks very similar to the vine, but it's a lot darker. You could already see without even blending how dark that is. But then once you blend, and I've seen students use multiple fingers, so I can use my ring finger, my pinky, my middle finger, my thumb, my index. I use my thumb. It's really, really dark. And you can see there's almost a dark gray and a black. So that's something to consider. Because once I go back, let's say, for example, if this was a mistake, if I start erasing, it's still there. Even if that's with my kneaded eraser. Even if I use my white eraser, it's still there, right? So try to use your compressed really later, meaning towards the end of your drawing. Later, when we get into our white, you could work with your compressed white charcoal on top of your black. Let's actually do that now. So I'm going to, let's actually fill in the decanter. I'm looking at this as a sort of square that's sort of receding. So here's all four sides. Because I want that sort of really interesting, the alcohol in the bottle, that really beautiful rich red to kind of become almost black. But then we'll add highlights on top of that because it's glass, right? We have to showcase the differences between the container and the liquid, which is a very big difference, as well as a different material, which is the metal on top of the stag. You guys, let me know if I'm going too fast. Okay. This is the top. Hopefully you guys can see that. It's a little hard on the camera, but I'm going to use my middle finger to kind of blend in, as well as my index. But there's a roughness and there's a textural area, which I appreciate. If you don't want that, start always again with the vine and then slowly go back and add more details by using it as a pencil with the compressed and kind of make series of lines. You can say like, okay, that's the base right about there, right? How's that one? How's the other side of that base right about there? Again, I'm just factoring in the height in terms of what's larger. Obviously my white planter here is the largest. Second largest in this kind of cluster of three objects is the decanter, and that wooden candle on the bottom will be the third. Again, any questions so far? Okay, no questions. I always get a little nervous when I hear no questions.
This is Ista. I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
For the tape that you have around the borders, do you have like a certain border length, or like
No,
it doesn't matter how thick it is, or can it just be like an inch out?
Yeah. So this is about 2 inches from the edge.
Okay.
Again, cropped it inward so I can make it a little bit smaller. Once I'm done with the drawing, I could be able to let it sit for a second, take as much of any excess charcoal off, kind of just raise my drawing upward onto a wall, let it all fall, or take it outside if you want. I could also
Okay.
spray some fixative to kind of seal in my charcoal drawing. And again, if you guys need fixative, I do have some in my office. Just bring in your drawings. I could seal it. The fixative sort of seals everything up. It doesn't like get smeary. I've seen students do this on accident, like their side of their hand gets into the drawing, which is okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But if you don't want that to happen, I have a really interesting spray, which actually I'll send out as an announcement. If you're interested in buying some, you can do that as well. But I mean, you don't have to. The tape, again, is a guide, so it doesn't get over the edge of my paper. It just keeps it really clean. It's optional. It's completely optional for everybody. But I just want you guys to have that the ability to use the tape to your advantage. Now the tape, the blue tape that we're going to use, not this one, because I ran out of blue tape, will be very useful for the next drawing as well as the following, which was the ink wash, because you'll start to see how the water buckles and bows the more and more we add it onto our Strathmore paper, because it's only 80 pounds. It starts to move around. So you want to ground it on a flat surface so it doesn't move, so you don't have any problems, and it gets much more easier to work with. But if you do need more tape, just let me know. I do have a bunch more in my office.
And the fixative, do you put that on once you're finished, or in between drawings?
You could do it either way. To be honest, I have seen students doing spray like 2 to 3 layers of the fixative over one layer, and then added more drawing charcoals on top, and then added another layer. What that does is sort of seals it all together. But if you want to do it all at once, and once it's finished, you could do that as well. I like to use it a lot for my drawings. I'm very messy, because subconsciously we don't like see how much pressure we apply until we are aware of it. Let's say if I'm drawing on this side and I forget this hand is on the surface and I do this, it becomes a problem. But then I'm like, oh, I could use my fixative, just kind of spray this area to lock it down. But then the problem is I can't go back, meaning I can't erase that. The fixative is like a sealer, it's a primer. It sort of kind of conducts all of your drawing as like a finished layer. So you can't really go back. You could add on top of it, but you can't go back. Does that make sense?
Yep, totally. Thank you.
Of course. Okay, here's the decanter. Any other questions? Sorry. Okay. I'm going to work around my base. You can see once it goes over that vine, look how dark that is. That's amazing. Let's say, for example, now, actually work around that. I'm also working on this. Look at that. That's crazy how dark that is. It almost becomes like a pitch black shadow, which is beautiful. There's something really rich about that sort of really high contrast dark, which is interesting. But you'll see, let's say, for example, now if I take my Kneaded Eraser, okay, and then you want to fold it. Again, you guys will have newer Kneaded Eraser, so yours looks like a square. This looks like Play-Doh because I've used it for multiple years. Don't ever throw this away. It's still good. You could take your Kneaded Eraser, you can start removing some of the vine, and you can start to kind of almost, again, model and start molding your drawing. So for example, when I had that highlight, kind of have a really light gray, blend that in there. And again, I have to factor in this index is dirtier. My middle finger is a little bit cleaner, but my ring finger is almost clean. You could also wash your hands if you want to do this, but I can start blending that in. And you can feel some of the Kneaded Eraser on that, by the way. Again, this is an eraser. In the same way how we erase, you get those marks. these little kind of dirtier marks. It's okay, it's still on there, but you could actually remove that off with your fingers. And this is why this process is a little dirty, but it's okay. And then just very gently, you could just blow on the surface. You don't want all throughout your entire counter, because again, this is a dirty process. Okay, you could also take a paper towel and kind of smear that off, but just be careful, don't smear too much, don't apply too much gravity. A little bit goes a long way. And now if I take my white, I can actually start adding a little bit more pressure, but you can see there's a hint of white that comes up. And it's kind of hard to tell in the camera, but you can see there's a different value. This is a lot darker gray. This is a more cooler gray, which is interesting. Now you can blend that in. I like to really get in there and see how that sort of reacts. But then you could also take your white eraser and even go further and start making some highlights, but not too much. This is where the material becomes the tool, okay? But you don't want to use this as the crutch, right? I see a lot of students have that problem of using the charcoal all as that one sort of value, which you can, but then don't rely too much on the eraser. You should really have fun with it and see how much you could remove and then add and then remove and then add, which gets really exciting. Okay, now let's go back to that decanter. I'm going to start now just erasing parts of it, not too much, because again, halfway point, which is right about here, is my liquid. And I forget there's my M. There's a sort of a monogram M on the front of this side. So I need to factor that in. And I need to redo my stag's head. Take my kneaded eraser, start removing some of my charcoal. I want to see where those highlights are. There's some right behind here. I'm not going to highlight, I'm not going to remove all of it. Okay, I want to have some of those darks. Some of those imperfections are great. Again, guys, if I'm going too fast, please let me know. There's a little bit on the bottom because there's this sort of pool. There's almost like a kind of a lighter gray of the red. I think there's wine in here, if I'm not mistaken.
This is Iced. I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
When would you use the regular kneaded eraser versus the white?
Well, it depends on how much you want to take off. With the kneaded eraser, again, you mold it, a nice flat side. You could, I'm going to erase some of this candle here. You could start to kind of take it off on this sort of earlier drawing that we did with the vine. But once you get into your white, the white takes off more.
I see. Gotcha.
And you'll see how much easier that is. But then let's say, for example, if I drew the same object with my compress, it's extremely difficult with the kneaded eraser, and it gets a little bit easier with the white, but the white does take off more. The kneaded, you can actually make beautiful textures with some of the drapery, some of the foliage, some of the textures you want to add. And I've seen a lot of students, and if you can, try to look at some of those examples on the website under students' work, you'll start to see some of those areas in the drawings that they've made. They've used actually the kneaded eraser to make those texture. This is a wonderful tool to use when you're working with charcoal, because then let's say, for example, I like to like make little spins. I always like to think about it like my mom makes these little Kurdish cookies with her hands. So this is sort of what I like to remember them by, but then I like to mold them. And then on the base, right about here, she actually makes like similar marks when she's making her dough. I kind of remind myself that it's sort of similar to that, but it takes off a lot of the charcoal. But then also, if you want to leave some of it in there, take your fingers and kind of blend in some of that. and I'll get a really interesting, nice value. Again, depending on where my light source is coming from. My light source is coming in from the right. Okay, that makes sense?
Yep.
Okay, so then now I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive, just for the sake of the demo. Okay, I'm going to work with the background, and what I'm going to do is actually add more vine, because again, we're working kind of both ways. We began with the vine, we went to the compress, we went a little bit to the white. I want to go back to the vine. Also, I'm now going to add some darker marks in the background for my value. But I remembered these are my kind of vertical lines for my eucalyptus. I'm going to use my kneaded eraser and my compressed charcoal to make each individual petal of the eucalyptus. So each leaf of the eucalyptus will be depicted in a very abstract way. I'm not going to draw each one like this. I'm not going to do that because to me that's repetitive and redundant. It's not exciting that way. There's a way you actually can make it much more quicker if you're thinking about it much more abstractly. And I can show you guys how to do that. Again, this is sort of one style, one sort of approach. This is not ultimately the correct way or the wrong way to do it. This is just one way. Darken some of these areas. I'm going to go very quick so you guys can see how fast I want you guys. You can, if you want to, again, depending on your approach, tackle this drawing. You don't have to, but it's an option. Okay. Already now the bottom half, this 3/4 of the drawing is sort of quote unquote modeled in and filled in. I'm going to take my hand and kind of blend that in there because I really want to get into the tooth of my paper. What I mean by that is getting into the fibers, into the surface. And I remember my stag's head, that's sort of where the center line is, or the focal point. Oh, hold on, I forgot my candle. Okay, there's the candle. Very quick. Not worrying about any detail at all, okay? Because the minute I do, it's gonna hinder the drawing and it's gonna make a much more problematic approach because you're worrying about the small, minute things. You're not looking at it holistically as a whole, okay? It's really important. Again, guys, you really gotta take your time and do not rush this process. This shouldn't take no more than 3 hours, to be honest. Okay, taking my compressed. I'm now working with a little bit more darks. I'm gonna add in some of the darks. I'm going around the wooden candle. I think that's a candle, if I'm not mistaken. We're gonna call it a candle. How about that? Okay, and then now the base of the muddler. Notice it's slightly lowered now because in the vine it was a lot higher. I can correct that composition. And what I actually like to do, and I advise this to students, this is going to sound very strange. If you have a reference, and if it's printed or if it's on your phone or tablet, whatever, flip. Just remove some tape. Now, don't be scared if I do this. I want you to flip your drawing upside down. This is very strange, but you'll see how this helps you read the composition. And one of this is a sort of a trick that I like to use when I'm figuring out my the beginning process of my drawing, is I'm mapping out certain things, but once you sort of flip it right back up in the correct orientation, your mind was tricked in the beginning because our minds are perceived to look at something the correct way. But once you flip something, you're not focused on the minute detail. You're actually focused on what you're actually seeing, which is a strange object, right? Certain things obviously are recognizable, but they're upside down, which tricks your mind to tell yourself to worry about those other things that are important, which is the composition. And once you flip it back, you'll see what happens. It's almost sort of a magic trick. Sorry, my surface is a little difficult to navigate. We're going to do the similar technique, and we'll talk a little bit about ideas of how to apply the grid, if you want to work with the grid notion in terms of making your composition. But when we get into our wild animal portraits with color. But in this early stages, okay, it's really very loose. And then we're now focusing on the composition's detail. That makes sense? Is that correct? Hold on. Can you guys see this? Okay, perfect. Let's put in my leaves. I'm using my compressed. Going over it, the vine. I'm using my side. And again, I'm going to go over it with my kneaded eraser, kind of remove, subtract, add, and then add more highlights depending on where I want it. And obviously it's a little bit difficult to see in the camera, but the actual surface of the drawing is very dirty, which is okay, okay? If you're, for example, working at this stage and you stopped, just if you can slightly, put the cover of your Strathmore paper over it so it doesn't move or kind of come across. You could also put some wax paper if you want. You don't have to, but if you don't want to mess up your drawing, just try not to move it around too much. So once you come back to it the next day or the next evening, whatever when you want to work on it, you could come back to it and it's ready to go. Here is that candle. And then there's interesting, there's a platform right about here. And I notice I haven't even talked about the texture of the plaid, which is important. But then that's a question I need to ask myself. Do I want to add that in there? It's depending if I would like to. I can if I do. Here's the top of that. Let's get my stag. Let me just zoom in on my reference because my eyes are really bad and I apologize. Okay. The head of the stag is about 3/4. So he's right about, this is his eye, and I'm just using the compressed. Oh, actually, yeah, let me do that. Okay, here is the antlers. Can y'all see that? I know it's a little bit difficult. I'll zoom in my camera.
Yep.
Let me zoom in now. My camera sometimes falls and I apologize. Is that better? Okay, lower this. Okay, mouth of the stag's right about there. There's the neck. Is this a reindeer? I think it's a reindeer if I'm not mistaken. Or, I mean, I don't know, to be honest, I don't know what the difference is. There's the eye, okay. There's the nostrils, okay. Very abstract, not worrying about any detail. There's the neck, one side of the neck. There's the other side. And I need to actually make it straight. So that side. Change this perspective, be a little bit closer to the left. Okay. And then I'm going to work. How tall is his head? The head is a little big, but I actually appreciate that because I like big heads on the animal. It's interesting because you may have some more imperfections that way. Okay, there's the stag. Now I'm going to work this. Then use my kneaded. compress to go back and add thicker, what are they called? Antlers. Just making lines, all I'm doing. Ear sockets. Okay. Use my fingers, I'm gonna blend that in. And around that, it's a little bit lighter, which is interesting. So I'm gonna start racing around it. You can start to see the stag's head. And again, guys, I can't see on the side of my camera, so let me know if there's any difficulty, please. I'm more than happy to change my orientation of the camera. Okay, stag is there. I'm gonna zoom out so the camera doesn't fall. Oop. To the left, to the right. Is that good? Okay. Questions so far?
Hi, this is Renee.
Go ahead, Renee.
I just have a quick question. Will you show us the reference photo again really fast?
Yes. Hold on, my hands are dirty. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna wash my hands, just 2 seconds. And Renee, that image or the reference should be on Canvas, FYI, or in the lecture. Should be in the lecture because we just went over it. But if not, we're going to look at it here.
I have a very tiny screen, so it's hard to switch
Oh,
without
I'm so
getting
sorry.
lost. No, it's okay.
Oh, okay. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Go back. Okay. And notice I just washed my hands. There's still charcoal on my fingers. If this is going to bother you, you could wear gloves. I actually like to use, well, not necessarily charcoal, but if you want, you could use baby oil at the end, because baby oil, it's very cheap, it's only $1. I use it for my painting class, or if students have, whatever, it's acrylic, mainly oil on their skin, which is slightly, could be harmful. The baby oil actually takes all of that off. It's really good for your skin too, by the way. My nerves here are slightly gone, so I can't feel anything from my index to my thumb. So once I get to my middle ring and my pinky, some of the nerves come back, hopefully. I know it's strange. That's what happens when you don't wear gloves. So not to freak anybody out. So if you want to wear gloves, by all means, charcoal will not kill you. FYI, none of the materials will kill you, hopefully. Okay, what was I doing? I was working on, where's my compressed? Here it is. Let's work on the bottom. Let's get these two objects in there. So I have my rose quartz. I think it's called rose quartz. Yeah, the pink rock, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So there's this composition. And then there's also, it's interesting, there's almost a beam of light that goes through. It looks like there's like a little mini light on this side. I'm gonna make some just vertical lines. Just go right through, which is interesting. I'm also gonna darken around the rose quartz. This is my compressed. And this is interesting too, between the rock and the goblet, like right around here, there's a dark shadow that sort of curves on that side. I'm gonna start, I'm actually gonna use the paper towel just for the sake of the demo. Take your one finger, cover it up with your paper towel. You could blend that in there. But the only problem is it also takes it off. So that's also another thing. The reason why I like to use my finger is because our hands are much more oily. It gets into that, again, the fiber, the material. And you could almost feel it being blended into that surface. So now I can have a wonderful kind of value scale here. okay? But then my goblet's very tall. It's actually, excuse me, it's not over here, it's actually higher. It's right about, because the more closer it is to us, the bigger it is, which is interesting. And it's foreshortened, meaning the sides, again, are going to be wider. That's how big it is. So this, I'm going to remove. Okay, there it is. And then I'm going to take the tip and start to draw a line. Another line. Connect that. Can we see that? Is it hard to see? If it is, guys, just let me know. Top. That's the top. That's really difficult to see. I apologize. Let me start erasing so we can see it better. Am I needed? Actually, no. We'll switch to white eraser. And this is where the kind of fun part happens when I start to work with glass. I personally love drawing glass because it's very difficult, but it's also very liberating. And a part of that is sort of getting, again, trusting where those darks and lights are. And then allowing your eraser to do the job instead of the charcoal. It's more counterintuitive, obviously, but it's also interesting to see. Let's say, for example, here's some lights. There's windows on that side. I'm going to make a kind of convex, it's going to sound strange, reflection of the window, because that's what I want to see. Because if it's opaque, we don't see anything, right? But it's transparent. So there's wonderful reflections and transparency behind it. And then I notice on the back or the top of the goblet here, there's the base of that surface as well as the shadow. So I'm gonna actually darken the right side because it's transparent, right? It goes right through the background. Does that make sense? Okay. Take my compressed. I'm gonna make a line that goes directly in the center. And then that will then again tell me where the base is. I just made a sort of vertical line and a horizontal smaller line at the bottom that indicates where the base is. And I take the side of my compress, just hover it back and forth as a upside down smiley face. And then do the same thing here with a smiley face. Now I have the bottom. Oh, that's really difficult. Okay, let me blend that in. You guys can see it. And let me start erasing. Okay. And also take the side of my compressed. Make the actual base, or the stem, excuse me, not the base, the stem of the goblet. Adding some darker values on the back. Okay, that's the base. Can we see that, guys, clearly, hopefully? Okay. There's also some value that runs through right about there, which is just sort of where the plaid is, but I want to add that in there. And I'm just very lightly going over it, just making a curved line. Because in theory, what's being reflected is also being off its axis, meaning the perspective of the light is going to change the value of how each horizontal or vertical line, say for example, in the windows, this is the windows, it's going to be off, right? But I know intuitively, those are windows, right? But you can see that perspective change. These vertical lines meet in a vanishing point, right about here. So it changes the perspective because it's a rounded object, right? It's a sphere, or it's a circle, excuse me. But a part of that, I also need to change the sort of the geometry of how some of the other objects are going to bend and curve, right? So again, it's more counterintuitive. So you work what's through, not what's not only around, but what's through the object, which is the goblet. That makes sense, hopefully. Darken some of that. Also, I'm going to bring in this line. This, remember, we talked about there's a base under these three objects. There's that line that kind of runs through and touches that bottom. And then around here, I'm going to darken this. And then that plat actually runs through this way. And there's another curve. This is the base. Erase this so you guys can see this. This is the base of my goblet. Can you all see that? Okay. But there's also a value underneath here. I'm going to darken this, but I need to be cautious not to go over this glass. But you can see it now in terms of how that bends and curves. Can we see it now? There you go. Camera's okay. Perfect. But then now, I'm going to take my lovely white, and this is where things get exciting. You want to actually apply a lot of pressure with the white once you get into your highlights, especially over your compressed. Oop, see, I already made that mistake again. It happened. It happened again. I put my hand onto this side, which I forgot. Okay. Again, it's human nature. It's bound to happen, but it's okay. So if it does happen, remember, lift your hand off to the surface and then take your compressed white and start adding some highlights. I'm going over some of those lines of those darker charcoals.
This is Rebecca. I have a question.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
I'm curious, with charcoal, does it work to use the piece of paper like to help from smearing, or does that still smear it?
You say that one more time. Does it help the paper smear it, you said?
Does it help to use like a piece of paper like that you put on top? Like
You can, yeah, you can do that. I've actually seen students use just paper towels. Let's say, for example, I'll take this paper towel, I'm gonna put it right there. So if my hand wants to rest, obviously you want this to be dry, you don't want it to be wet. This one's slightly wet, it's okay. It's a little damp. If I take my hand and sort of rest it like that, it shouldn't smear, because then slowly once you remove it, none of it should come off. Some of it did because it's wet, but
Okay.
none of it should come off. You could use a piece of paper, you could use a paper towel.
So
Either one works. Go ahead.
you need to be like careful not to move it? Like, will it smear everything if you're like
It will.
move? Yeah, okay.
Because if let's say, for example, if I went over that goblet, since again, this is damp, and if I, for example, I'm gonna add just some whites here, just pretend I'm working, and if I did that, you can see some of it came off. That's a big chunk, and that's problematic because now this is slightly now gray. It's okay, obviously, you're bound to have those mistakes, but that's why you really want to just take your time and not kind of rush it. But if you do it with Divine, which will also smear, it's going to be a lot easier to kind of put back because it's a lot more lighter. But the compressed kind of smears on certain areas, and it's harder to, let's say, for example, like say if this was a correction, you want to go back, you can erase it, but there's still a little bit of residue. There's still kind of like a ghost image that's still on there. That makes sense, Rebecca? Is it Rebecca?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. We have, okay, so we're about 7:50. We're good on time. Keep going. So then now, where's my white? Here's. I'm going to go over certain areas and actually make some highlights. Now I can do this, for example, let's say if I add a layer of vine, And I can always go back and forth or over my goblet. You know, it gets really dark. It's okay. But notice I added a little bit of white. The white is still showing. There's a really interesting relationship between, let's say, for example, if you darken an object, and if you wanted to add highlights and not just erase, but just go back and add white, you can do that. And you can see that's a bright white. That's brighter than the surface of your clean side of your drawing, meaning the clean side of the paper, right? But then if I go back and start blending that, you get an interesting texture. Do you see that? Does that look clear on the camera, hopefully? But then I also need to go back and add in some of those values. Let's say, for example, this is where that window that's kind of off, that access. And add in some. And then not forget my fabric. Oh, hold on, I'll just in here. Okay. I can blend it. And now it starts to blend in with some of the whites. And I kind of like that texture. And it's obviously, once you guys start to experiment, you'll start to see really interesting, highly contrasted sort of drawing come up in relationship to other things that are much more softer. Okay. Did that make sense? Okay, I'm gonna pause for the time being. I'm gonna work on this drawing later on as well. And then hopefully this will be posted on canvas.com under the video demonstration modules tab. If you have